For 30 long years, I drank poison from the hands of the man who swore to protect me. Every dinner, every blessing, every gesture of false care brought me closer to death. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eleanor Winters. I'm 78 years old, and today I'm going to share the most painful story of my life. A story I kept silent for a long time, but one I now feel I need to tell, so other women don't go through what I experienced. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It means so much to know my story is reaching people. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my words can travel far, perhaps even to places I've never had the chance to visit. I was born in 1947 in a small town called Pine Creek, Ohio. They were different times. Times when girls like me dreamed of a good marriage, a house with a garden, healthy children. My mother taught me to sew, cook, be a good wife. The rest comes naturally, she'd say. How wrong I was to believe that. I met Richard at a 4th of July picnic in 1957. I was 17. He was 22. I remember it like it was yesterday. He was leaning against a tree, smoking a cigarette, watching me as I danced. He had a serious, respectful manner. His eyes never left mine, even when other young men tried to get his attention. At the end of the celebration, he approached and asked my father's permission to walk me home. My father, who was very strict, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Yes." Richard came from a family of small business owners. He was hard-working, didn't drink or gamble. A good catch, as they said back then. Our courtship was brief. In 6 months we were engaged. We married in January 1958 in a simple ceremony at the town church. I had just turned 18 and felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Richard had secured a job at the only factory in the area, a metal works that processed materials for construction. He earned enough for us to buy a small 2-bedroom house with a little yard where I planted herbs and flowers. In the early years, we were very happy, or at least I believed we were. He brought me small gifts, hair ribbons, fabric for a new dress, flowers he picked on his way home from work. On Sundays, we went to church and afterward walked through the town square. Other girls looked at me with envy. Richard was handsome, hard-working, and most importantly, seemed to love me more than anything. In 1960, our first child, Andrew, was born. It was a difficult delivery. I was very weak afterward. Richard proved to be an attentive father. He helped with the baby when he came home from work. He let me rest. "You need to recover properly, Eleanor," he would say. "I want you strong and healthy by my side." 3 years later came Karen. Once again, Richard was understanding about my exhaustion, my pains, my slow recovery. He took care of the children on weekends so I could rest. Sometimes he spent hours in the kitchen preparing Sunday lunch, refusing my help. "You already do so much," he would say. "Let me take care of you today." It was after Karen's birth that small changes began, so subtle at first that I hardly noticed. Richard started questioning my outings. If I mentioned visiting my friend Olivia, who lived 2 blocks away, he would frown. "That gossip? What do you talk about so much?" When my mother fell ill and I suggested spending a few days at her house to help, Richard said we couldn't leave the children without a father for so long. "And what if I get sick too? Who will take care of me?" So they were always quick visits, with a set time to return. I remember once, I must have been about 25, when I received an invitation to a cousin's birthday in Cincinnati. It was a 4-hour bus ride. Richard didn't want me to go. "It's dangerous, Eleanor. What if the bus breaks down? What if you fall ill far from home?" I ended up not going. When I told my cousin over the phone, she was upset, but said she understood. "Your husband is just worried about you." It was around this time that I started experiencing the first symptoms. Frequent headaches, fatigue that didn't go away with rest. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart racing in a cold sweat. Richard took me to Dr. Thompson, the only doctor in town. Nerves was the diagnosis. "Your wife is very sensitive, Mr. Winters. She needs peace and quiet." Richard left the office, shaking his head with concern. See? The doctor agrees with me. You need to stay home more, rest more. And so, little by little, my world closed in. Visits to friends became rarer, trips to my parents' house too. Even Sunday church, which had been sacred for us, began to be questioned when I wasn't feeling well. What will people think, Eleanor? That I'm not taking good care of you. Better to stay home today. God understands. One night in 1966, I'll never forget this date, Richard came home from work with a different expression, serious, almost solemn. He sat at the dinner table, looked at me for a long time and said, "Eleanor, I had a strange dream yesterday." He rarely talked about dreams, so I paid attention. "I dreamed you were very ill, at death's door. A voice told me someone wanted to harm you, poison your food. I was frightened by this. We had no enemies, at least none that I knew of. I talked to old Tom today." Old Tom was an elderly man who lived on the outskirts of town. They said he had powers, that he knew things nobody else knew. Some people consulted him in secret, although the pastor condemned this practice. Old Tom taught me a prayer, a protection against evil, against anything they might put in your food. Richard took from his pocket a slightly tarnished silver spoon. This spoon belonged to my grandmother. Old Tom blessed it. He said, "If I pray over your food every night with this spoon, nothing bad can reach you." I was speechless. Richard had always been a practical, rational man, had never shown interest in blessings and superstitions, but he seemed so serious, so convinced. "It's just to protect you, Eleanor. It doesn't cost anything, right?" And so the ritual began. Every night, when we sat down to dinner, Richard would take the spoon from his pocket, mumble some words I couldn't understand, and stir my food before I started eating. The children found it funny at first. "Dad's doing magic on Mom's food," Andrew would say, laughing. Karen, always more serious, watched with narrowed eyes, as if trying to understand, but they soon got used to it, as children get used to any routine. I got used to it too. After all, I'd been raised in a religious family. I believed in the power of faith, of prayer. If Richard wanted to protect me that way, why not? Perhaps it would even help with those persistent headaches, that weakness that only grew worse. Little did I know that each night, each dinner, each gesture of apparent devotion and care was, in fact, another dose of poison entering my body. That the spoon Richard guarded so carefully had notches on the underside where he accumulated lead shavings scraped from old pipes at the factory. That the man who said he loved me was slowly and methodically killing me. It's hard to talk about this even after so many years. Sometimes my voice falters, my hands shake more than usual. It's not just the memory of the horror I lived through. It's also for the time lost, for the life that could have been and wasn't. But I'm here today to tell this story to the end. Because silence only protects the abusers, and because maybe, just maybe, my words can save someone who is living their own nightmare without realizing it. By 30, I looked 60. My body was breaking down before my eyes, and no one could understand why. Except, of course, the man who every night blessed my plate with a devotion that, I now know, hid the cruelest of intentions. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible. First came the headaches that became my constant companion, then the weakness in my legs. I remember one morning in 1971. I was hanging clothes on the line when I simply collapsed to the ground. I couldn't get up for almost half an hour. I lay there looking at the blue sky, the clothes swaying above me, feeling a fear I'd never experienced before. "What's happening to me?" I asked myself as silent tears ran down my face. When Richard came home from work and found me still sitting in the yard, the clothes half in the basket, he seemed genuinely concerned. He held my trembling hands in his and said, "We're going to Dr. Thompson first thing tomorrow. We can't put this off any longer." Doctor. Thompson was an elderly man, the town's doctor for decades. He examined me carefully, asked questions, frowned at my answers. Bone pain, weakness, dizziness, memory problems. He muttered, making notes. In the end, he looked at Richard, not at me, and said, "It could be a nervous condition. Many women suffer from this after having children. The hormones, you know? Or perhaps anemia. Let's try an iron tonic." I left the office with a prescription for an iron and vitamin-based medicine, and a terrible feeling that I hadn't been taken seriously. Nervous condition seemed a polite way of saying, "It's all in your head." Richard bought the medicine that same day. Every morning, he himself would serve me a spoonful of the dark, bitter syrup. "To make you strong, my love." I obediently swallowed, expecting improvements that never came. In fact, I got worse. My hair, which had always been thick and shiny, began to fall out in clumps. Sometimes, when combing, I'd fill my hands with loose strands and cry, hidden in the bathroom so the children wouldn't see me. My skin turned pale, with a grayish tone that no rouge could disguise. The worst were the tremors. They started almost imperceptibly, a slight tremor in my hands when holding a cup. But over time, they became so severe that I could barely bring a spoon to my mouth without spilling food. It was humiliating. Andrew, then 13, often had to help me eat. "It's no problem, Mom," he would say, with a maturity beyond his years. "Everyone needs help sometimes." Karen, at 10, watched me with serious, worried eyes. Once I caught her crying, hidden behind the shed. When I asked what had happened, she hugged me tight and said, "I'm afraid you're going to die, Mom." It broke my heart. I hugged my daughter with all the strength I had left and promised, "I won't die, my love. Mom is just sick, but she'll get better." A promise I wasn't sure I could keep. In 1973, we returned to Dr. Thompson. This time, he seemed more concerned. My symptoms had worsened and new ones had appeared. I began having memory lapses. Sometimes I would forget what I was saying in the middle of a sentence. Other times I wouldn't recognize familiar faces for a few frightening seconds. "It could be a degenerative disease," he said, again to Richard, as if I weren't present. "Perhaps we should consult a specialist in Cincinnati." I saw Richard's face change. A flash of, was it worry, fear, anger? It was so quick I couldn't identify it. "Cincinnati is far away," he replied. "Eleanor can't handle a trip like that in her condition, and the children need her. Isn't there anything you can do here?" Dr. Thompson sighed, looked at me with something that seemed like pity, and prescribed more medicines. Sedatives for the tremors, vitamins for the weakness, something to help with the memory. Nothing worked, of course. How could it, when the true cause of my illness continued to be poured into my plate every night, spoonful after spoonful, year after year? Gradually, my world closed like the petals of a flower at dusk. I could no longer cook without help. The pots were too heavy for my weak arms. The tremors made it dangerous to handle knives or be near the stove. Richard then decided I shouldn't cook anymore. "It's for your own good, Eleanor. You need to rest. I can prepare meals when I get home from work, or Karen can help. She's old enough." So I lost yet another piece of my autonomy. Soon Richard controlled everything. The food I ate, the medicines I took, who could visit me and when. The house, which had once been my kingdom, became my prison. Visits to friends ceased completely. "You're not in any condition," Richard would say. "And they have their own lives, their own problems. They don't want to be taking care of a sick person." Sometimes, very rarely, a friend would come to see me. They would sit by my side, hold my trembling hands, tell me the town news. I noticed their looks of pity, how they struggled not to show shock at my appearance. And I also noticed how Richard stayed nearby during these visits, like an attentive guard. Once, my friend Olivia, who had always been more direct, asked if I had considered consulting another doctor. "My cousin in Columbus knows a very good neurologist," she said. "Perhaps he could—" "We've already discussed this," Richard interrupted, entering the room with a tray of coffee. "Dr. Thompson is doing everything he can, and Eleanor is in no condition to be traveling around looking for miracles." Olivia didn't come back after that day. My mother died in 1975, without me being able to say a proper goodbye to her. Richard said I was too weak to go to the funeral. My father followed 2 years later. Again, I couldn't attend. My brothers would visit occasionally, but the visits were always tense, with Richard present the whole time, answering questions that were directed at me. "How are you really feeling, Eleanor?" my older brother asked once when Richard briefly left the room. I hesitated, not knowing how to express the despair growing inside me. "I feel trapped, James, as if I'm slowly sinking and no one can see me." Before he could respond, Richard returned. The conversation changed to safer topics. As the 1970s progressed, my condition deteriorated. The tremors worsened to the point where I needed help even to dress myself. I had difficulty forming complete sentences at times, as if the words slipped from my mind before I could grasp them. My teeth began to loosen. I developed a bluish line on my gums that Dr. Thompson couldn't explain. The strangest thing was that when Richard traveled for work, which happened rarely, I seemed to improve a little. Not much, not enough to raise suspicions, but enough for me to notice the difference. At the time, I attributed it to stress. Perhaps I became nervous with his constant presence, his suffocating concern. I never imagined the true reason. In 1978, Andrew finished school and got a job in Cincinnati. I remember the day he left. I held his young face between my trembling hands and said, "Go, build your life, be happy." Inside, my heart was breaking. Part of me, a selfish part, I admit, wanted to beg him to stay, not to leave me alone in that house that increasingly felt like a prison. Karen stayed. She had finished school too, but refused several job opportunities far from home. "Someone needs to take care of you, Mom," she would say. My sweet girl sacrificing her youth for me. The guilt I felt was almost as painful as my physical symptoms. Richard seemed satisfied with her decision to stay. "It's good to have you at home, daughter. Your mother needs a woman's hand to help her." And so we entered the 1980s. I was already in my 40s, but I looked 70. When I looked in the mirror, something I avoided doing whenever possible, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Thin, lifeless hair, gray skin, dull, sunken eyes, a body curved with constant pain. Who was that stranger in the mirror? Where was the vibrant young woman who once dreamed of love, family, happiness? The blessing ritual continued night after night. It was already part of the family routine, so common that no one questioned it anymore. Richard would take the spoon from his pocket, mumble his inaudible words, stir my plate. I would eat obediently, grateful for the care, the protection, poisoning myself a little more each day without knowing. They say a drop of water can pierce a stone, not by force, but by persistence. Lead worked the same way in my body, drop by drop, night after night, year after year, accumulating in my bones, in my blood, in my brain, slowly robbing me of everything, my health, my independence, my identity. And Richard? He was seen in town as the exemplary husband, the dedicated man who cared for his sick wife with admirable devotion. "How lucky you are to have a husband like that, Mrs. Winters," people would say when they saw me on the street, leaning on his arm or on a cane. "Such a patient, careful man." I would agree, thank them, smile an empty smile. What else could I do? Who would believe me if I said something was wrong? That there were moments when I caught a strange look in his eyes, something cold, calculating, almost satisfied to see me stumble over words or drop a glass because of the tremors. And even if someone believed me, what could be done? I was completely dependent on him. I had nowhere to go, no way to support myself. The children were following their own lives. Andrew was already engaged in Cincinnati. Karen had started a serious relationship with a young man from the neighboring town. Soon, she too would leave, and then it would be just Richard and me. Me and my tormentor. Me and the man who, without my knowing it, was slowly killing me. Until the collapse came, that fateful day that would change everything. The day when the truth, bitter and poisonous as the lead in my blood, would finally come to light. It was a Tuesday in May 1988. I remember perfectly because that morning there was a special program on the radio about the upcoming presidential election. Ironically, I was listening to talk about American values while living in my own form of captivity without even knowing it. Karen had gone to the market, and I was alone at home. Richard was working at the factory and wouldn't return until late afternoon. I decided, in a rare moment of energy, to prepare some tea for myself. Something simple that I thought was within my limited capabilities. The kettle was too heavy for my trembling hands. When the water began to boil, I tried to lift it from the stove. It was as if an electric current ran through my body. A violent spasm shook my arms. The kettle escaped, the boiling water spreading across the kitchen floor. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. I fell. The pain from the burn was immediate, but something else was happening, something much worse. It was as if every muscle in my body was contracting at the same time. I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't scream for help, just lay there on the cold kitchen floor, feeling my body revolt against me, my vision darkening at the edges. I'm going to die here, I thought with surprising clarity, alone on my kitchen floor. I don't know how long I lay there, minutes, hours. Consciousness came and went in waves. At some point, I heard a muffled scream, as if coming from very far away. It was Karen, back from the market, finding her mother lying in a pool of water and blood. What followed was a blur of sensations and fragmented images. Sirens, strange hands touching me. Karen's insistent voice, "Hold on a little longer, Mom. We're almost at the hospital." Hospital? That word penetrated the fog of my mind with a stab of fear. Richard had always been against taking me to hospitals. "Dr. Thompson knows your case," he would always say. "Those hospital doctors will just fill you with medicines that don't work." My next clear memory is of waking up in a white antiseptic room with tubes attached to my arms and a constant beep from some nearby machine. A young nurse was adjusting something beside my bed. When she saw I was awake, she smiled gently. "Welcome back, Mrs. Winters. You gave your family quite a scare." I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. She offered me some water with a straw. I swallowed with difficulty. "Where am I?" I managed to ask. "Cincinnati Regional Hospital. The ambulance brought you yesterday. You collapsed at home." Cincinnati was the big city closest to us, about 80 miles from Pine Creek. What was I doing so far from home? Before I could ask more, the door opened and a young man in a white coat entered. He was about 30, with thin-framed glasses and a small notebook in his hand. "Mrs. Winters, glad you're awake. I'm Dr. Samuel Harris, neurologist. How are you feeling?" I tried to take inventory of my body. It hurt. Everything hurt, but that wasn't anything new. "Weak, in pain," I answered with difficulty. He approached, examined my pupils with a small light, checked the machines. "You had a quite severe convulsive episode. Do you know if this has happened before?" I shook my head negatively, the movement making my vision spin. "And these tremors, how long have you had them?" "Years," I replied. "Many years. They're getting worse." "Doctor." Harris noted something in his notebook. He seemed genuinely interested, genuinely concerned. It was strange to be looked at like this, like a person, not a burden or an obligation. "Mrs. Winters, your daughter told us you have a long history of neurological problems. She described very specific symptoms: progressive tremors, memory problems, muscle weakness, a bluish line on the gums. We're doing some tests to confirm my suspicions." At that moment, the door opened again. It was Richard. His normally composed face showed signs of tension. His brow furrowed, jaw tight. "What's going on here? Why was my wife brought so far from home?" Dr. Harris turned to him, extending his hand. "Mr. Winters, I presume. I'm Dr. Samuel Harris, the neurologist responsible for your wife's case." Richard ignored the extended hand. "Her doctor is Dr. Thompson in Pine Creek. He knows her history, knows how to treat her. As soon as she's in a condition to leave, I'm taking her back. Doctor." Harris remained calm, but I noticed a subtle change in his posture. "Sir, your wife had a severe collapse. We need to discover the exact cause before she can be discharged. We've already initiated some tests." "And what tests?" Richard interrupted, his voice rising. "Complete blood work, a brain scan, and—" The doctor hesitated for an instant. "A test to check for the presence of heavy metals in the body." I saw something pass across Richard's face. A flash of, was it fear? "Heavy metals? What are you insinuating?" Dr. Harris maintained his professional tone. "I'm not insinuating anything, sir. I'm investigating all possibilities. Your wife's symptoms are consistent with several conditions, including heavy metal poisoning, such as lead or mercury. It's just standard protocol." Richard was very quiet for a moment. Then his face softened into an expression I knew well. The concerned, devoted husband. "Doctor, I understand your diligence, but you need to understand. My wife is fragile, both physically and emotionally. All these tests will tire her out, and the longer she's away from home, the worse it is for her. Dr. Thompson has been treating her for years." "And yet," Dr. Harris gently interrupted, "her condition has only worsened, hasn't it?" A tense silence filled the room. I suddenly felt exhausted, as if just watching this exchange had drained my last strength. My eyes closed against my will. When I woke again, it was night. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by a faint light from the corridor. Karen was sitting in a chair beside the bed, leafing through a magazine. When she noticed I was awake, she approached and held my hand. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Tired," I replied. "Where's your father?" A shadow crossed her face. "He went to get some things from home. He'll be back tomorrow." She hesitated, then added, "Mom, Doctor Harris wants to talk to you. Alone. He said it's important." I felt a tightness in my chest. "About what?" "He didn't say, just asked me to prepare you. He'll come in the morning." I didn't sleep well that night, despite the sedatives they gave me. Strange, fragmented dreams populated my restless sleep. In one of them, I saw Richard standing over me, the silver spoon in his hand, his face a mask without expression, as he poured a silvery liquid into my open mouth. I woke up breathless, my heart racing. Morning came, gray and rainy. Dr. Harris entered my room around 9 o'clock. He carried a folder in his hands and had a grave expression on his face. "Mrs. Winters," he began, sitting in the chair beside the bed, "what I'm about to tell you is very serious. I received the results of your toxicology tests. You have extremely high levels of lead in your blood, levels that indicate prolonged exposure for many years." I blinked, trying to understand. "Lead? How?" "That's what we need to find out. Lead exposure can happen in various ways. Old plumbing, old paint, certain types of ceramics. But the levels found in your body are, well, they're extraordinarily high, indicating constant and significant exposure, something beyond casual contact." He paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "Mrs. Winters, can you think of any way you might be regularly exposed to lead? Something in your daily routine? In your diet, perhaps?" At that moment, an image flashed in my mind. The slightly tarnished silver spoon, Richard's hand stirring my plate, night after night, year after year, the blessing to protect me. My voice came out as a whisper. "The spoon?" "What spoon, Mrs. Winters?" I told him. About the ritual that began more than 20 years ago. About how Richard blessed my food every night with a special spoon he kept in his pocket. About how my health problems started shortly after that. About how, on the rare occasions when Richard traveled, I felt a little better. Dr. Harris listened to everything in silence, his face becoming more serious with each word. When I finished, he took a deep breath. "Mrs. Winters, what I'm about to ask is very delicate. Is there a possibility? Do you think it possible that your husband is deliberately putting lead in your food?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. My mind refused to process it. Richard, my husband of 30 years, the father of my children, deliberately poisoning me? It was absurd, impossible. And yet, I don't know, I answered honestly. I can't believe he would do that. Why? For what purpose? Unfortunately, said Dr. Harris, there are documented cases of similar situations. It's a form of abuse called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The person deliberately makes someone under their care ill to receive attention, sympathy, or to maintain control over the victim. Control. The word echoed in my mind. Wasn't that exactly what Richard had achieved? Total control over me, over my body, my life. What do we do now? I asked, my voice trembling. First, we're going to treat you. We'll begin a procedure called chelation therapy to remove the lead from your system. It will take time, and unfortunately, some damage may be permanent. As for the rest, he hesitated, we need to be sure. I'm going to ask your daughter to bring that spoon for analysis without alerting your husband. In the days that followed, I lived in a state of shock and disbelief. Richard came to visit me daily, always bringing flowers, always playing the role of the devoted husband. I observed him now with new eyes, looking for signs of, what? Evil? Madness? But I saw only the man I had known for decades. A week later, Dr. Harris asked to speak with me again. This time, Karen was with him. She seemed to have aged 10 years, her face pale, her eyes red, as if she had cried a lot. We analyzed the spoon, Dr. Harris said, without preamble. We found lead residue in the notches on the underside, notches that seemed to have been made deliberately. Karen sobbed quietly. Mom, I found something else hidden in the garage, in an old toolbox, pieces of old lead pipes, a file, and a diary. A diary? The word fell like a stone in my stomach. What did it say? She exchanged a look with the doctor, who nodded slightly. Dad recorded everything, how much lead he used, how your symptoms progressed. It was like an experiment for him. Her voice faltered. He wrote that he needed to keep you sick so that you wouldn't leave him like his mother left his father. The room seemed to spin around me. The story Richard had told me so many times about how his father had been abandoned, how he had died of grief after his mother ran off with another man. Was that it? All this horror, this slow torture because of an irrational fear of abandonment? We've called the police, Dr. Harris said softly. They're investigating. Your husband will be questioned. I don't know how I survived the days that followed. The news spread, first throughout the hospital, then through the town. Andrew came from Cincinnati, horrified, guilty for not having noticed, for having left his mother in that situation. The authorities went to our house, found more evidence, the interrogation, the confession. Richard admitted everything. How it started with small doses, testing. How he became fascinated with the power he had over me, watching my health deteriorate, making me increasingly dependent on him. How he enjoyed being seen as the exemplary husband, the man who sacrificed everything to care for his sick wife. And yes, the underlying fear that if I were healthy, one day I might leave him. He was tried and convicted. I didn't follow the process. I was too busy fighting for my own life, for my recovery. The chelation therapy was long and painful. I spent months in the hospital, then more time in a rehabilitation clinic. The lead had caused permanent damage to my nervous system. The doctors said I would always have tremors, would always have memory problems, would always suffer pain. 30 years of poisoning doesn't pass without leaving marks, but I was alive, and for the first time in decades, truly free. When I was discharged from the hospital in November 1988, I was a different woman from the one who was carried in on a stretcher 6 months earlier. Not just in body, still fragile, still marked by the poison, but mainly in spirit. Something had broken inside me the day I discovered the truth, but something new was also beginning to grow. A fierce determination I didn't know I possessed. I couldn't go back to our house in Pine Creek. Those walls held 30 years of a lie that had nearly killed me. Every room, Every piece of furniture, every utensil would remind me of the horror I had lived through without knowing it. Besides, the people in town already knew everything. The story of the husband who poisoned his wife for decades had become national news. Reporters from newspapers in Cincinnati and even from New York had tried to interview me at the hospital. Dr. Harris kept them away, protecting my privacy like a guardian angel. "You need peace to recover," he would say. "These people just want a spectacle." Karen, my brave daughter, had found a small apartment in Cincinnati for the two of us. It was close to the hospital, where I still needed to go 3 times a week to continue treatment. It was on the 3rd floor with no elevator, which presented a challenge for my weak legs, but she insisted it would be good for my rehabilitation to climb up and down the stairs every day. "Exercise, Mom." The physical therapist said it's essential for you to regain strength. She was right, of course. Even though at first each step seemed like a mountain, the apartment was small but bright. For the first time in decades, I had a space that was genuinely mine. Karen had arranged everything with great care: light curtains, some potted plants, a comfortable armchair near the window from where I could watch the street, a small sanctuary of healing. In the first few months, my life came down to a rigorous routine of treatments, exercises, and rest. The physical therapy sessions were painful, but each small progress was celebrated as a great victory. The day I managed to hold a cup without spilling the tea. The first time I walked to the end of the hospital corridor without needing to stop and rest. The morning I woke up and could form a clear thought, without the mental fog that had been my companion for so long. Dr. Harris continued to supervise my case even after I was transferred from hospital care to outpatient treatment. He had become more than a doctor. He was a friend, a confidant. "You're the most remarkable case of resilience I've ever seen," he told me one day after reviewing my tests. "Honestly, with the amount of lead we found in your system, it's a miracle you survived." "It wasn't a miracle, doctor," I replied. "It was stubbornness." He laughed, but his eyes were serious. "What do you plan to do now, Mrs. Winters? You're progressing well. Soon you won't need such intensive medical care anymore." The question caught me off guard. What did I plan to do? For decades, I hadn't been allowed to plan anything. My life was managed, controlled, decided by someone else. Freedom was a concept as strange to me as it would be to a bird that had spent its entire life in a cage. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I'm 48 years old. No formal education beyond elementary school, no professional skills, and a body that will never be the same." "But you have a sharp mind and experiences few people have had," he countered, "and you have a story that could help others." His words planted a seed that would take time to germinate. Meanwhile, I had other battles ahead, the divorce, for example. Even imprisoned, Richard was still legally my husband. The lawyer Andrew hired for me explained that under the circumstances, it would be a straightforward process, and it was. The judge didn't hesitate to grant not only the divorce, but also alimony to be paid from Richard's assets that were seized. "It's not much," said the lawyer, "but it will allow you to support yourself while you recover." There were also the ghosts to face, the nightmares that woke me up sweating in the middle of the night, the panic I felt when someone approached my food, the automatic distrust of any show of care or concern. The guilt for not having noticed earlier, for having allowed my children to grow up in that toxic environment. "It wasn't your fault," repeated Dr. Lisa, the psychologist who began seeing me 3 months after my discharge. "You were the victim of systematic abuse, meticulously planned, a kind of brainwashing that happened slowly over decades." Intellectually, I knew she was right, but emotions don't follow logic. The feeling of having been so completely deceived, betrayed by the man I trusted most, was a wound that would take much longer to heal than the physical damage. The worst part was facing the questions, my own and others. How did I not notice? How did I not suspect? How could I have been so blind? "You saw what you expected to see," Dr. Lisa explained. "It's human nature." And he was meticulous, patient, planned every detail so your suspicions would never be aroused. He was a sophisticated predator. Slowly, session after session, I began to understand the dynamics of what I had lived through. How Richard had created an invisible prison around me, how he had isolated me from friends and family, how he had positioned himself as my protector, my savior, the only person who really cared about me, a classic abuser, just using more sophisticated methods than physical violence. "You were in an abusive relationship from the start," said Dr. Lisa. "The poisoning was just the physical manifestation of a control that began much earlier." It was hard to accept this. It meant admitting that my entire adult life had been built on lies, that the love I thought I had lived never really existed. But with this painful acceptance also came liberation. If I could admit this, I could leave it behind. I could start again. And that's what I did, one small step at a time. In the summer of 1989, Karen enrolled me in an adult education program in the local community. It was a basic literacy and mathematics course, designed primarily for workers who never had the opportunity to study. I had completed elementary school, so I knew how to read and write, but decades of isolation and the effects of lead poisoning had impaired these skills. On the first day, sitting in a classroom for the first time in more than 30 years, I felt ridiculous, a woman of almost 50, trembling hands, trying to hold a pencil alongside much younger men and women. I almost gave up that very day. "I can't do this," I told Karen when we returned home. "I'll be a failure." "Mom," she replied, holding my trembling hands in hers, "you've already survived the impossible. Learning to write better is nothing compared to what you've already faced." She was right, of course, and so I swallowed my pride and returned the next day, and the next, and the next. The teacher, Mrs. Miller, a woman in her 40s with a gentle smile and infinite patience, soon noticed my specific difficulties. She adapted exercises for me, found ways to work around the hand tremors, gave me extra time when needed. "You have an eager mind, Mrs. Winters," she told me one day. "It's as if you're making up for lost time." And it was true. I discovered in myself a hunger for learning that I had never felt before, or perhaps had always been there, just stifled by the circumstances of my life. Each new word I managed to write clearly, each math problem I solved correctly, was a small victory against the past, an affirmation that Richard had not completely destroyed my mind. 3 months later, I had completed the basic course. Mrs. Miller suggested I continue studying, maybe even completing high school through an adult education program. The idea frightened me, but also excited me. Me, Eleanor Winters, a student at 48. Why not? It was during this period that I met other women in my situation, not victims of poisoning, that fortunately seemed to be rare, but survivors of other types of abuse. Women who had lived years, sometimes decades, under the control of violent husbands or partners, who had finally found the strength to escape, to rebuild their lives. Maria, who had fled with 3 young children after 15 years of beatings. Sophia, whose scar on her face was a daily reminder of the time her husband attacked her with a broken bottle. Louise, who for years had to hand over every cent she earned to an alcoholic companion, living in poverty despite working 2 jobs. We met in a room at the back of the local church once a week. At first I just listened. Their stories were different from mine in details, but the pattern was the same. The isolation, the control, the gradual deterioration of self-esteem, until the victim believes she deserves the abuse, or at least believes she cannot escape it. "How did you get out?" I asked one evening, after weeks of just listening. "My oldest son turned 18 and said he would kill his father if he hit me again," Maria replied. I realized I had raised my children in a cycle of violence. We left that same night. "My sister," said Sophia. "She didn't give up on me, even when I pushed her away for years. She was there when I finally asked for help." "I hit rock bottom," Louise recounted. "Either I left or I killed myself. I chose to live." Each story was a mirror where I saw reflections of my own experience. Each survivor carried scars, visible or invisible, but they were all there, alive, fighting, rebuilding. At one of these meetings, I finally shared my story. I spoke of the blessing ritual, the decades of unexplained deterioration, the shocking discovery at the hospital. I spoke of the notched spoon, the macabre diary where Richard coldly recorded my slow destruction. When I finished, the silence in the room was palpable. Then one by one, the women approached and hugged me. There was no pity in their eyes, only recognition, empathy, a solidarity born of shared experiences. "You're stronger than you think," said Maria, holding my trembling hands without any sign of repulsion or pity. "Surviving that is extraordinary." I left that meeting with a new feeling, a warmth in my chest that I recognized after some reflection as purpose. Perhaps this was what Dr. Harris had suggested months earlier. Perhaps my story, my experience could serve a greater good. The following week, I asked Isabel, the social worker who coordinated the group, if I could be more actively involved. "I have no training, no professional experience," I explained, "but I have lived through it and have a genuine desire to help other women recognize signs that I didn't see." Isabel smiled. "Mrs. Winters, sometimes lived experience is worth more than any diploma. We need women like you, who have gone through the fire and come out the other side." That's how, almost without realizing it, I found my vocation at 48 years old. First as a volunteer in the support group, then, as I completed my studies and took specific courses, as a kind of mentor for women freshly out of abusive relationships. It wasn't easy work. Each story I heard reopened my own wounds. Each time I held the hands of a terrified woman, trembling with fear of what the future held away from her abuser, it was like reliving my own fears. But there was also healing in this process. Each woman I helped find her path to freedom was a small redemption for my own lost years. And while helping others rebuild, I rebuilt myself, piece by piece, day by day. Eleanor Winters was no longer just the victim of a horror story. She was a survivor, a student, a counselor, a woman rediscovering her own strength bit by bit. In 1990, almost 2 years after the collapse that changed my life, Andrew invited me to his wedding in Cincinnati. I hesitated. The idea of being at a large social event, of being observed, perhaps judged, was frightening, but it was my son's wedding. I couldn't let fear rob me of another precious moment in life. "I'll be there," I promised. I wouldn't miss it for anything. On the wedding day, Karen helped me get ready. I chose a light blue dress, modest but elegant. My hair, which never fully regained the thickness of my youth, was arranged in a simple bun. My hands still trembled, of course, that would never change, but I had learned to live with this limitation. When I entered the church arm in arm with Andrew for the ceremony, I felt the looks, some curious, others compassionate, but I didn't care. At that moment, I was just a proud mother, accompanying her son to the altar. Nothing else mattered. During the reception, an elderly lady approached me. I vaguely recognized her as a distant aunt of Teresa, the bride. "You're Eleanor, aren't you? The groom's mother." When I nodded, she continued, "I heard your story. What a horror you went through, my dear. How did you manage to survive something like that?" I looked at her for a moment, considering how to respond. Finally, I said, "One day at a time. And now I live, not just survive. I live." Today, at 78, when I look at my wrinkled and still trembling hands, I don't just see the marks of the poison that ran through my veins for 3 decades. I also see the countless hands these hands have held, the tears they've wiped away, the doors they've opened for women who, like me once, couldn't see a way out. Time is curious in how it transforms our wounds into gifts. Who would have thought that spoon, the instrument of my torment for so many years, would symbolically become the most valuable metal I carry? The 1990s were a period of reconstruction for me. I finished high school in 1992, at 52. I remember graduation day as if it were yesterday. Karen and Andrew were there, proud, applauding when I received my diploma. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the journey taken to get there. That same year, the Cincinnati Women's Support Center offered me a paid position as a counselor. It wasn't much money, but it meant that for the first time in my adult life, I had my own income, the fruit of my own work. The feeling of financial independence, even modest, was intoxicating. "You have a gift for this, Mrs. Winters," said Elaine, the center's coordinator. "Women trust you, open up to you, perhaps because they know there's nothing they can tell that will shock you." It was true. After what I lived through, few accounts of abuse surprised me, not that it made it easier to hear each story. My heart still clenched with each new report of violence, manipulation, control. But I had developed an ability to listen without crumbling, to offer strength without succumbing to the weight of others' stories. In 1995, I participated in a pilot project that brought information about domestic violence to schools in the region. We talked to adolescents, girls and boys, about healthy versus abusive relationships, about warning signs, about how to help friends who might be in risky situations. The first school I visited, I trembled more than usual, not from fear, but from emotion. There were young people of 15, 16, the age I was when I met Richard, so full of dreams and expectations as I had once been. If I could plant in them the seeds of awareness that I had lacked, perhaps I could prevent other Eleanors from emerging. "My name is Eleanor Winters," I began, my voice firmer than I expected. "And for 30 years, I was poisoned by the man who swore to love and protect me." I saw the shocked looks, the instant attention that opening provoked. I told my story in a simple, direct way, without sensationalism. I spoke of the signs I didn't see or ignored, the gradual isolation, the control over my friendships, over my outings, over my body. I explained how abusers build invisible prisons, how they make their victims doubt their own sanity, their own perception of reality. When I finished, the silence in the room was palpable. Then, a girl in the last row raised her hand. "My aunt," she began, her voice trembling. "I think my aunt is experiencing something similar." I stayed after the talk to speak with her privately. I guided her on how to approach the situation, what resources existed in the community, how to offer support without judgment. A week later, I received news that her aunt had sought out the support center. She was the first of many. That same year, Karen married Thomas, the history teacher she had met at the college where she was studying education. The wedding was small, just family and close friends, but unforgettable. My daughter, so strong, so resilient, who had postponed her own dreams to take care of me, deserved all the happiness in the world. "Mom," she told me on the eve of the wedding, "everything I am today, I owe to you. Your strength taught me more than any book." "No, my daughter," I replied, holding her face between my trembling hands. "It was you who taught me the meaning of courage. It was you who saved me." In 1997, a new page opened in my life. I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on domestic violence in Washington, D.C. The idea of traveling alone so far, of speaking before specialists, authorities, and activists terrified me. But something I learned in my journey was that growth is on the other side of fear. "Go, Mrs. Winters," encouraged Elaine. "Your story needs to be heard beyond our walls." That plane trip, the first of my life, was a surreal experience. Looking out the window, seeing the clouds below me, I felt a strange peace, as if I were literally above the horrors of the past, floating in a new beginning. The conference was a watershed moment. I spoke to a packed room without notes or teleprompter, just with the raw truth of my experience. I told about the blessing ritual, about the years of unexplained deterioration, about the discovery at the hospital. I also spoke about reconstruction, about the importance of support networks, about how we need to educate not just potential victims, but society as a whole about the subtle signs of abuse. When I finished, the entire room rose in applause. Delegates from other states came to ask for contacts, suggest partnerships, invite me to similar events. Journalists wanted interviews. It was overwhelming, but also deeply gratifying. I returned to Cincinnati with a new vision of what I could accomplish. In the following years, I traveled to various cities across America, sharing my story and helping to establish new support groups, new educational programs, always with my trembling hands, always with the sequelae of poisoning as constant companions, but increasingly comfortable in my new skin as an educator, as an activist, as a survivor who transformed her pain into purpose. In 2001, at 61, I published my first book, The Silver Spoon, a story of survival and rebirth. It's not a sophisticated literary work. I wrote with the simple language of someone who completed their studies late in life, but it's honest to the core. The book narrates not just the horror of the poisoning, but mainly the journey of healing and rediscovery that came after. The major publishers weren't interested, so it was published by a small regional press with a modest print run. To my surprise, the book found its audience. It sold more than expected, mainly among professionals who work with victims of violence and among the survivors themselves. I received letters, dozens of them, from women who identified with different aspects of my story. Women who, through my words, finally named what they were experiencing. "Your book saved my life," wrote a reader from Oregon. "I recognized my husband on every page. I left home the day after reading it." Another letter from a social worker in Atlanta said, "We use your book in our support groups. The women finally understand that they're not alone, that there is life, a full life, after abuse." In 2005, the biggest surprise, a national publisher decided to re-release the book with distribution throughout the United States. At 65, I found myself on a tour of lectures and book signings. My hands still trembled when signing books, but now that tremor was part of my story, part of my testimony. I no longer tried to hide it. At one of these sessions in Chicago, a woman in her 70s waited patiently in line. When her turn came, she didn't ask for an autograph. Instead, she extended a hand to me, a hand that trembled as much as mine. "Mercury, in my case," she said simply. My husband was a dentist. No more words were necessary. I stood up and hugged her. Two survivors united by an experience few could understand. The work continued over the years. Even when I officially retired from the support center at 70, I didn't stop. I just slowed down, becoming a mentor for younger counselors, participating in selected events, maintaining a small bi-weekly support group in my own home. In 2015, when I turned 75, Andrew, Karen, and my 5 grandchildren organized a surprise party. People came from all phases of my life, from the first women I helped at the support center, some now elderly ladies like me, to young counselors I had met in recent trainings. Dr. Harris, now retired and with completely white hair, came specially from Boston. Dr. Lisa, my first psychologist, now over 80, was also there. "Eleanor," said Dr. Harris during the toast, "when I met you in that hospital in 1988, I feared you wouldn't survive the month. Today, 30 years later, I look at you and see not just a survivor, but a beacon for so many others. It's an honor to have been part of your story." I cried without shame, surrounded by so many people who had walked with me in different stretches of this improbable journey. In recent years, I've slowed down even more. The tremors have worsened with age, and new health problems have arisen, not related to the lead, just the natural wear of the years, but I remain active in my own way. I maintain a small blog where I share reflections, respond to readers' letters, occasionally participate in interviews for documentaries or reports about domestic violence. In 2021, Ohio State University awarded me an honorary degree in recognition of my 3 decades of work in raising awareness and combating violence against women. Me, who barely completed high school, receiving an academic honor. Life has these sweet ironies. In my acceptance speech, I said something that has become a kind of mantra for me in recent years. The poison he put in my body was meant to destroy me. Instead, it turned me into an antidote for other women. And that's how I see my story now, looking back at 78 years old. What Richard did was not the end of my story. It was just the first chapter of a much richer, much more meaningful life than he could ever have imagined. I never saw him again after the trial. I learned that he died in prison in 2003 without ever having shown true remorse for what he did. For many years, I carried hatred for him. Then, a controlled anger. Eventually, a painful indifference. Today, I feel mostly pity. Pity for the man so destroyed by his own fears and insecurities that he needed to literally poison someone to feel control. Forgiveness didn't come quickly or easily, but it came. Not for him, but for me, because I realized that carrying the weight of hatred was like continuing to drink the poison he could no longer give me. My hands never stopped trembling. My memory never returned to what it was. Some days, the pain in my bones is almost unbearable. These are the visible scars I carry, the medals of a battle that lasted 30 years and which, against all odds, I won. But the real victories aren't these. They're the hundreds of women I've helped find their voice, their power. They're the educational programs I've helped create, the public policies to which I contributed my testimony. It's seeing my granddaughters grow up strong, confident, knowledgeable of their rights and their value. It's waking up each morning in my small apartment, now on the ground floor, a concession to age, and preparing my own coffee just the way I like it. It's caring for my plants in the small backyard garden, feeling the earth between my fingers. It's choosing what I'll eat, what I'll wear, where I'll go, whom I'll meet. It's the everyday freedom many take for granted, but which for me is a daily miracle. And if you're watching this video, perhaps it's because something in my story echoed in you. Perhaps you too are in an invisible prison, not knowing how to escape. Or perhaps you know someone in that situation. If that's the case, I want you to know there is a way out. There is life, a full, meaningful life after abuse. It won't be easy. The journey may be long and frightening, but you have more strength than you imagine. And you don't need to make this journey alone. There are people and resources available to help. The first time you reach out and say, "I need help," may be the hardest thing you've ever done, but it will also be the first step toward freedom. I know this because I lived it. The spoon he used to poison me ended up becoming the most valuable medal I carry, a symbol of everything I survived, everything I overcame. And if I could do it, you can too. Before ending, I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. Share it with anyone you think needs to hear this story. Sometimes, a simple video can be the push someone needs to seek help. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from. It moves me to know that my story is reaching people from different places, perhaps even saving lives I'll never know. Thank you very much for listening.